Okay. How was everybody?
Good.
Good. Settle down. Okay, let's get to it. The National Broadband Plan proposed that we have 500 megahertz of spectrum added to the commercial sector by 2020, 300 of that by 2015. We're a few weeks away from 2014. You could go have a lot of questions about this. First is, do you think that the FCC has any hope of succeeding, of reaching either of the two goals, either 3 or 5? And in that response, do you think that satisfying that goal is going to involve some portion of that spectrum in a sharing type model? And secondly, where, if not in a sharing type model, or even if in a sharing type model, where is it going to come from? Charla?
You want me to go first?
Sure.
Thanks. It's a good question. I mean, it's the goal, you're right, we're, I mean, if you count to the end of 2015, we're 2 years away from 300, and there are several things on the table. And the Commission already counts, I think it's about 65 megahertz that they say, you know, with the upcoming auctions next year, as well as the WCS spectrum and, you know, some of the MSS spectrum being reallocated in a way to allow mobile services. So, I mean, that leaves, you know, a few hundred megahertz left. So can they do it? The question is how successful, number one, will incentive auctions be? And I think, you know, I think where our view is, you know, there's a lot of work to be done, but there's still, you know, a great amount of you know, I think there's some possibility there that we will get a fair amount of spectrum out of it. What is not clear to me is where, you know, even if we get a lot, that's 120 megahertz. So it's not clear to me where we're going to come up, frankly, you know, to meet the 300. I'm not sure where it'll come from at this point, unless you count maybe 3.5, which is sharing. And I do think, you know, I think, you know, one of the things that I always say, and I hear it said a lot more often now, is that you really have to think about all of the above. In this case, you can't say that it's all going to be cleared spectrum, it's all going to be through technological change, it's all going to be through incentive auctions, it's all going to be shared. And I think what's interesting to me is, you know, in economics speak, is what the Commission is going through, and the government and several other parties, is almost like a natural experiment that we'll see, because several things are going on right now. First off, you have what the, you know, industry itself is doing. You know, moving to 4G technologies, moving to more small cells, you know, moving to a lot more efficient technologies. You know, Rich just told us that's not enough, but, you know, we know it's something. Then we also have, you know, major look at clearing spectrum going on right now with the 1755 paired with 2155. 3.5 is going to be, you know, a sharing experiment that'll include, you know, what's interesting is unlicensed like spectrum, but it'll still have, you know, a license. It'll need to have, you know, some sort of general authorization, as well as the Commission is saying probably licensed spectrum, in addition to the incumbent radar users in that band. And then 5 gigahertz will be another example of sharing, but done, you know, with, you know, probably more, you know, traditional type of unlicensed. So, you know, we've been asking ourselves this. I mean, how is the Commission going to count this? You know, I have to say, if they get, you know, 3.5 is done by 2015, if every, you know, that absolutely is something that we and other companies are looking at to provide capacity for broadband. So it would be fair to count it. So, you know, I guess I'm sort of convincing myself that they have a way of reaching this. I do think that there's a lot of work to be done. And frankly, you know, one thing that, you know, sort of in the PCAST report, you were talking about all the things you didn't like about it. But, you know, I think there's a lot that was very interesting in that report. But the thing that I found most difficult is it's sort of, well, we can't do this because it's hard. And that just, to me, is not an appropriate answer. You know, so getting back to what I still consider the gold standard, which is clearing spectrum, you know, we need to continue to look at ways to do that. And, you know, I still firmly believe that there are ways to create incentives for the government to actually want to give up spectrum and clear it for, you know, maybe in some cases it will be unlicensed use, maybe in other cases it will be what Tom talked about, you know, liberalized licensing. This is very different from the, you know, sort of the little tiny blocks that people are talking about. You know, so it's I do think that, again, you know, it's a long, you know, convoluted answer, but it sort of comes down to all of the above, and you know, I think it's still within reach.
And I also think it's encouraging the 1755, 1780 sort of announcement where DoD traditionally is, we need all of our spectrum, everything is critical for national security, we don't want to give any of it away. And I think it's encouraging that they have shown a willingness to say, okay, we're going to try to clear 1755 to 1780, so it could be auctioned off as part of AWS 3, and we're going to move some of our systems to 2025, 2110. It may take some time, we need to be compensated for it, but I think that is significant in showing a turn to show more willingness to do what they need to do to use spectrum more efficiently, because they failed.
Right. You mentioned the unlicensed use, and I know, David, you're interested in that yourself, 5 gigahertz.
Absolutely, it's a big priority, I think, for Comcast and for the industry. You heard Rich's presentation about the volume of traffic that's going to be going over these mobile networks relying on the Cisco data primarily. One of the key points in that Cisco report is that by 2016, 50% of all IP traffic will be going over Wi-Fi networks. So when you ask where we're going to get 300 megahertz in the next 2 years, and obviously 500 in the next 7 years, we have to look at how we're going to supply Wi-Fi with additional spectrum as well. I think now, just even by recognizing this, by having an unlicensed discussion and this whole spectrum discussion today, we're starting to see the need in this town for a balanced spectrum approach. But we're talking about both licensed and unlicensed. Charla talked about it. You have different bands with different characteristics, and you have different incumbents who are able to tolerate sharing different, with different capacities. So I think, George, to answer your question, I think if we expanded to look at unlicensed and make sure that we have a robust Wi-Fi network to handle all of the traffic that's going to be going over the Wi-Fi technologies over the coming years, I think we can get to the interim 300 megahertz number at least by looking at the 5 gigahertz proceeding. There, the FCC started a proceeding in March after Congress directed it to look at the 5 gigahertz. We know that the Spectrum Act of 2012, the big news was the incentive auction, but there was some language in there directing the FCC to revisit its regulations and to take a look at the band and see what else can be done on the unlicensed side. And we think there, one of my colleagues testified before Congress a few weeks ago and indicated there were some significant opportunities to make some real...
No, dude.
Getting right to the end of your mind. You just... 1755 is wonderful. So we just think there's real opportunity to be made in 5 gigahertz and for some big allocations of spectrum. In particular, there's one band that we think the FCC can move on quickly, which is called Uni 1, which is at the bottom end of the 5 gigahertz. And there's 100 megahertz of spectrum there that could be put to use in a very quick time frame. We're talking months, maybe within a year or two, getting approval from the FCC to use some just higher power and allow for outdoor use. And with that, we can have significant impact on customers and everyone's broadband experience. When you access the internet through Wi-Fi, right now there is some congestion. There's a lot of devices sharing the 2.4 gigahertz band. And what the FCC said in this 5 gigahertz proceeding is we can make some significant improvements. Everyone in this room on a laptop probably is using Wi-Fi right now. Not everyone, but a lot of folks are probably using Wi-Fi. Some are using the LTE network as well. But we can make that better. And the FCC's 5 gigahertz proceeding is about that. And we think there's an opportunity to make 100 megahertz at least available next year, or 2014. So with that, I think that's a big step towards the 300 goal.
So George, I'm in Charla's camp. I'm thinking the FCC probably has a shot at getting this done in the 2015 time frame, as they say in Washington. But going back to the first panel, right, and thinking back to Rich's presentation showing the demand growth and the Cisco slide that we produce every year, I don't worry that Cisco has overestimated demand. I worry that we have underestimated demand. And when I look back through the time series of the Cisco BNI, we had no idea when tablets were going to come out, the impact that tablet use was going to have on mobile data. And that turned out to be a significant uptick in how consumers were consuming mobile spectrum. So what is the next thing that suddenly pops up out of the consumer electronics industry that gives us all a double take? And that's what I worry about. I worry about the impact of the Internet of Things, which is only at the bare beginning of being implemented, and what kind of impact that has. So I worry not so much about the next couple of years, because as an FCC alum, I have great confidence that my former colleagues are going to get the job done in all of these proceedings, and they're going to do a great job doing it. But I think about the curve beyond that. I think about the problems that Tom raised in the first panel. You know, we're just not good at transitioning spectrum from an old use to a new use. We haven't gotten good at that. I don't know to what extent we can generalize the learnings of the double-sided auction to other spectrum transitions. That's an interesting question. I don't know if we're going to be able to generalize that. And while I applaud the DoD and Terry Tukai for the excellent work they did at 1755, I wonder how much of that is attributable to the people who were involved in that proceeding as opposed to a replicable process that can be used going forward. Because we're just at the start of the challenges. The challenges will just keep coming. So those are the concerns that I worry about.
You know, Mary, you mentioned the DoD stuff there, which is really tremendous. We've all seen that in the news recently. But another decision DoD made earlier this summer was a similar decision in the 5 gigahertz band, where they said that they were looking at the 5 gigahertz band as an option to move some of these applications, and they decided that wasn't best. And in fact, they said that would be more appropriate spectrum to be used for unlicensed services. So there is some, I think, commercial rationality coming to the government's approach to spectrum, and that's a good thing. And we think the FCC should take advantage of that and move quickly on these areas before someone maybe changes their mind or revisits some of these market-based approach that we see in some bands at this time right now.
Well, you've got a lot of discussion now. We're talking about it here, sharing unlicensed uses. And is there any prospect that a sharing type regime or a unlicensed type regime could support the kind of high-powered mobile networks that Rich was talking about, the demand that piece of it? Using that kind, are we going to have to find exclusive arrangements to support that kind of investment?
I think the technology community is optimistic that our ability to share with incumbents is going to increase over time. I think most technology companies now, for example, in the 3.5 band, are thinking in terms of small cells, where the interference problems are more easily managed due to power levels. But that's not saying there aren't places in that 3.5 band that are removed from incumbent users today that couldn't be used for high-power macro cells. And so one of the questions that the FCC is going to have to resolve in that proceeding is how flexible do they want their rules to be. I think the challenge with sharing, though, and I speak from my experience in 5 gigahertz, where we've been sharing with the federal government across a range of incumbent uses since 2006, is one that we don't have institutions or processes or abilities to communicate commercial to government once the institution of sharing, or as I like to call it, the institution of marriage, kicks off. We're not good at that. And we have already had a stumble in the 5 gigahertz band where one of our federal agencies, the Federal Aviation Administration, hit a problem with their weather radar system. Instead of coming to the private sector and communicating the problem and getting us working on solving the problem, they sat on the problem for a year until it became apparent somehow that they were going to have to talk to the FCC about it, which they did. Now, this problem's been going on since 2009, The FCC spent a lot of time resolving it, but we're only now in the 5 gigahertz proceeding that David mentioned, going to get to a place where the FCC is going to put that problem behind us. It's going to resolve that problem for the FAA by changing equipment certification rules. And let me just say, just to clarify, without getting into the nitty-gritty detail, a lot of this was equipment certification rules that certain manufacturers were not following as completely as they should, and therefore they introduced too much user flexibility into the equipment that allowed users to violate the rules for the bans. So that is a problem that's got to be fixed. But there's no ability to communicate, and there's nothing to sort of force these federal agencies to talk about problems they're seeing. And as we do more and more sharing, and as we parse that radio spectrum closer and closer together, we're going to hit instances where we have got to communicate and go to marriage counseling. So that's what I worry about.
I think I want, if I may, one source of spectrum, we've seen this with Dish lately, for expanding the amount of spectrum that we have in mobile broadband is to take spectrum that has been stuck in some other use and repurpose it, or have the FCC write an order that says, okay, now you can use this. You've done a lot of that. Do we have more opportunities for that, for relatively low-hanging fruit?
I think there are. Dish likes bankruptcy. I mean, there's been 4, not for us, for others. There's been 4 primary auctions since 2008. The 700 megahertz FCC auction, the DBSD satellite company auction of 20 megahertz that was in bankruptcy, the TerreStar 20 megahertz bankruptcy auction, and the LightSquared auction that's going on right now. Dish won DBSD and TerreStar, and we participated and won some 7 megahertz spectrum. But I think there's an important difference between bankruptcy auctions, which I think are a great way for companies like Dish who want to enter the wireless business to acquire spectrum, and government auctions. The value of a bankruptcy auction is to maximize revenue to creditors so they can be paid off. The value of a government auction is to maximize value for the public. And I think that's an important difference that sometimes we lose sight of in all this discussion about incentive auctions. And what are the values to maximize to the public? Well, there's 2 values if we're talking about incentive auctions. The first value is to fund FirstNet. That's an important public trust. The second value is to ensure that consumers are protected and that competition increases. So as we decide on the auction rules to free up more spectrum from the government standpoint, bankruptcy standpoint, auction it off, goes to the highest bidder. That's great, and that's, I think, important. And I'm sure more companies will go bankrupt in the future. The Dish will be participating in trying to acquire those assets. But when we're talking about government auctions, it can't just be about revenue. There are other important values that we need to consider as the FCC is promulgating these rules.
You looking at me to have a response to that?
Oh, you're writing things down.
Oh, I just write. No, it's. I mean, it's interesting. I was interested to hear that you thought that the purpose of an auction was to increase competition. I'm not necessarily sure that that's. Has there been some suggestion there's not enough competition now in the marketplace? As a participant in that market, I would actually beg to differ. It's an incredibly competitive market, and most of the participants in the market would probably. You talk to anybody that runs these companies, and they're not sort of sitting counting their money waiting for the one customer after the other. So I'm not suggesting there isn't a good reason for the Commission to be concerned about making sure that competition exists. But I would argue that it's not, every auction isn't about increasing competition. And I'm not sure.
Well, when Verizon AT&T control 86% of the wireless revenues, from where you're sitting, I'm sure you think there's a lot of competition. But from where I'm sitting, we want to compete against you. We need more spectrum. And we participate in all the auctions. We can't be criticized.
Right.
We don't have a single wireless customer.
Well.
We don't have a single wireless customer,
Right.
and we participate in wireless accounts. And Our position is the FCC should just ensure that Verizon and AT&T are not able to acquire all of the spectrum. We want you acquiring some of the spectrum, and Cisco and all the vendors want you in there. We want you in there because having those
Our
chipsets.
customers actually
Yes.
kind of want us in there too.
And all we're saying is you shouldn't be able to get all of it. And a rule, and this is what the FCC should ask, and what the Spectrum Act actually tells the FCC to do, is it good for competition for AT&T and Verizon to be able to get all of it? And a lot of the debate has been AT&T and Verizon should be excluded. We're not arguing that, and I don't think T-Mobile and Sprint are arguing that. That's an extreme. You guys should not be excluded from the auction, period. But the other extreme is no rules, a free-for-all, where you're able to acquire all of it. I think that's a negative for competition. And if there's sensible limits that prevent 100% acquisition by the two dominant incumbents, I think that will encourage more participants, like Dish, the smaller carriers, Sprint, T-Mobile, and that will be good for the consumer. It will maximize value to the consumer and help competition.
Any thoughts on that, Mary? You staying out of that?
All three of my customers. I wave the white flag.
You just care that somebody buys it and puts it to use as soon as possible.
We have agreement, I guess. There should be reasonable limits for 600 megahertz.
I'll note, George, the question I think began with the notion that the licensing model creates the incentive to invest in networks.
Right.
And I'll note, I didn't get a chance to explain why a cable company is up here on the spectrum panel. But for those who don't know, Comcast and the other cable MSOs are in the process of building one of the largest Wi-Fi networks in the world, in the country, and eventually one of the largest in the world, presumably. And that is requiring a significant amount of investment. And that is an ecosystem where we don't have licenses. Yet we believe that the Wi-Fi ecosystem is so robust, and the opportunities for us to take that broadband product that we provide in the home, outside the home, using Wi-Fi, justifies the investment we're making in it. So there are other models besides the license model, which are going to produce tremendous social value and internet access. Right? We're going to be deploying, we announced at the testimony a few weeks ago, we already have 350,000 hotspots on the Comcast network with access to about another 100,000 to our cable MSO partners. And you can see that number just a year or two ago, I think we were at about 5,000 hotspots. So you see the way we're growing this network, which is a significant investment in an unlicensed band. And so we just want to make sure that band remains robust enough to handle all of that traffic. You see, there's as much as traffic is going to be growing on the cell phone network, on the traditional licensed mobile network, the Wi-Fi usage on these networks is growing even more. I think Mary mentioned tablets, right? No one predicted them when Cisco was starting their VNI study. I believe, and Charla, correct me if I'm wrong, that more tablets are sold that are Wi-Fi only than that are cellular. So all of that tablet growth, whatever the Wi-Fi was, that's on the Wi-Fi network. So we need to make sure that that ecosystem remains robust, because that is important for the consumer experience for broadband.
Well, you bring up an interesting point about licensed versus unlicensed. Is there potentially a model, I mean, this is fairly speculative, for a licensed, unlicensed regime, where you have private ownership of spectrum that is then made available to people? Perhaps every radio that's sold has to pay a fee to the spectrum holder, or you've got to download a piece of software to the device to actually access the spectrum annually, or some revenue generation model, but a model that permits, it looks more like a Wi-Fi model, and would a company like Comcast, given that you'd have better control of the congestion, be interested in?
Yeah, so and I know we all have some thoughts on this, but I don't like the part of the question where it says licensed versus unlicensed. I think we're beyond that discussion. And it's now, we have a variety of models and a variety of bands, and different models suit different bands based on, a lot of times based on incumbency, and then a lot of times based on technology. So I'll take issue with that description of it. But to the real point of your question is there a different model? than what we call traditional unlicensed, where the FCC sets up some broad parameters, and then in that model you innovate any way you want, and you develop. Wi-Fi was not a government mandated standard. It was engineers taking advantage of the parameters. And is there a new model? And I think that was what Charla was referring to in this interesting 3.5 proceeding, where the FCC doesn't believe that because of incumbency it can adopt the traditional unlicensed model, and because of that incumbency and the issues we've been discussing now since this morning about the incumbents and moving them, it doesn't believe it can move the incumbents. Yet there is an opportunity to bring commercial usage to the 3.5 gigahertz band. And we look forward to that kind of discussion. I don't think we know at Comcast how we would utilize that band, but we like the opportunity of putting perhaps some different market type principles on there that could solve some of the congestion issues that's inherent in unlicensed technologies, if you do it right. We have not thought about it, but at Jeff's point, how you would open that up, and who could participate, who could not. I don't think that's anywhere advanced. But the idea that we're looking for a third way in a particular band where the two existing ways don't seem to work well, I think that's a good thing.
So I've thought a lot about this idea of one spectrum owner controlling essentially a commons. And I remain skeptical that it's a model that would work. When I look at the unlicensed models we have today, they are based on the notion of very easy access, very easy entry into the business, using an interoperability forum to ensure from a consumer perspective that the Apple device I have works with the Belkin router, works with the whatever, right? And as a result of that, we have today in the Wi-Fi Alliance some 600 member companies participating in interoperability testing of equipment. Names that you would not recognize. Everything from the biggest companies like Cisco to very small companies who have something very cool to sell or have a new idea for how to implement Wi-Fi in the home or in business. When I look at the license model, what you see is really big consumer electronics companies offering handsets, right? Because they're the ones who have to take the time to understand the carrier requirements and to go through the process of making sure that their handset is going to work on whoever service provider network there is, right? And go through all of the steps necessary to satisfy the carrier that that's going to work. These are two different models. If you try to say, oh, let's have one spectrum owner and put a commons, let him operate a commons, you have the risk that that spectrum owner changes the rules for the operation of the commons in a way that disadvantages some or all of the participants in that market. So I don't see why those people who today are operating in the public commons get attracted to that private commons. I'm willing to, keep my eyes open and my mind open to that possibility. I just don't see how it happens.
But it wouldn't be overfished, I think, is the problem.
Well, that's what I was guessing that you were getting at, is a way to sort of deal with the issues of, the overuse of the commons issues. But what's interesting to me is I don't think there's anything in the Commission's rules right now to prevent that kind of model from taking place. Everything that you can do in unlicensed spectrum, we could actually do. You could do in the spectrum that you own. We could do it, but it's just the economics aren't there. And the other thing that we all have to remember that when we're talking about unlicensed versus licensed, and I shouldn't use the versus, but it's so hard not to say, because you're right, I think it has moved beyond that, is that the unlicensed assumes a network. In the licensed environment, we are the network, and that's a big difference. It's great that the tablets work in a lot of places, but if you just have Wi-Fi, they wouldn't really do much of anything. What you need is Wi-Fi connected to a network. And I think we lose sight of that when we talk about costs, when we talk about a lot of the economic issues, is that we refer to it, in other circumstances inside the companies, that they just assume the network, and it's a big assumption. So, and again, I just say that when we talk about the economics of these issues, it'd be important to remember that piece.
I think Mary's point touches on the economies of scale. That's the beauty of the Wi-Fi environment, where we've got these a billion devices which justify the kind of investment we're making in the network part. So you don't assume the network. We're obviously trying to build some of it for Wi-Fi, but we're assuming a billion devices, and therefore the network will come. In this discussion of 3.5, if you don't have the right set of rules and you don't have the devices because of that, then the network, and it's interesting, it's the reverse, right? So you're on the license model, the network, and then the handsets follow on what Mary was describing. And in the unlicensed model, it's the devices, and then in our case, the network follow. And so how you look at that third way, it's unclear. If you think that it's going to look more like the unlicensed model, then we have to have the devices will drive the investment in network. I think that scale. If there isn't that scale, I'm not sure you'll see the investment in network.
The development of, for example, you have Comcast, Verizon, and AT&T too. You see these Wi-Fi networks being widely deployed. I walk into stores and my iPhone gets an AT&T network. You know, Starbucks it used to be. I think they switched contracts. You know, Wi-Fi originally was thought of as being able to, you know, it's cheap to deploy in a certain location, so you can have lots and lots of people doing it. What we're tending to see is that the big network companies are the ones that are building these giant Wi-Fi networks. You think that's the way these networks are going to have to be built going forward? Is there potential for a competitive Wi-Fi alternative, or are these things going to be tied to the physical landline network?
Well, I think one thing you're seeing, George, is Wi-Fi technology itself has evolved, right? So it used to be you had a router, you plugged it in at home, and you got wireless access around your house, right? Or you went to the coffee shop and they had one plugged in, and that was all there was. And what's happened in the past couple of years, and you're seeing evidence of it, right, in your question, is that Wi-Fi has now evolved so that the security on the Wi-Fi system works with the mobile operator security, 3GPP standards, right? So you can immediately push someone when they walk into that Starbucks to the operator network without the user doing anything, right? The operator can control that, which I call the any port in a storm strategy. If you're trying to get people off your macro cell spectrum, get them onto Wi-Fi whenever you can, right? The other major development you're seeing, and you're seeing this in the cable deployments, right, that David talks about, is the ability to roam across operator Wi-Fi networks. And so Wi-Fi now has that roaming capability that it didn't used to have. So you can now have business models around that, which is what the MSOs have done. So Wi-Fi itself is evolving, and what you're seeing now is the implementation of that in the marketplace. But I think Wi-Fi going forward is all of the above. It's home users, it's enterprise users, it's roaming across Wi-Fi networks, it's use of Wi-Fi as an adjunct to high-power licensed mobile.
And I think what this is reflecting is really what consumers want. Consumers, we think, want 6 things, and none of us provide these six things to them. They want fixed voice, video, and data in their home. And they want mobile voice, video, and data. And they don't care where it's coming from. They just want to watch, the Super Bowl in 1080p or 4K, have their tablet watching, their TV in their room on a mobile device when they're in Starbucks. And so all of us are trying to figure out the best way to give consumers what they want. But if whoever's the first company that could offer all 6 of those things easily, cheaply, without caps, is going to be
You're going to ask the FCC.
And I think, and that's what we're all working for. And that's what, the Ciscos of the world trying to develop the technology, and the billions that Verizon is spending, the billions that Comcast is spending, and the billions that we're investing to acquire spectrum, so all of us could try to meet what consumers actually want.
It's going to be very hard, though, in the unlicensed space to replicate the ubiquity you see from the carrier. And that's not really, you were, I think, hinting at some of this, and that's not really what this is about. This is, when you go back to the earlier presentation about the growth in usage of mobile devices, it's not about, the customer doesn't care which network is run, it's about what's the best experience and where, and there's a ubiquity component to that. And there are times where Wi-Fi might be the better experience because of its ability to handle huge capacity. And there are times where the LTE network with its ubiquity is going to be the better experience. And you really are going to need both. But to Jeff's point about video, a lot of this is video driven, and on the mobile devices, video consumes a lot of spectrum. And that's where we think you need to come back to make sure there's enough allocation of spectrum for that Wi-Fi experience.
Just in case you're in the video business.
In case you care about video. We hope everyone still loves video.
Okay, we're having one more question, and it's probably you two be the best. You brought up a point today, Rich brought up a point today about equipment. And equipment has been an important and controversial policy area. You've got the C block, the Verizon ball, or bring whatever you want and use the spectrum. We've got new business models and cell phones. I just upgraded my phone, and AT&T's got its next plan where I'm essentially renting the phone from them. After a year, I can come back and rent a new one. Mobile's got a similar plan. Verizon may now, I don't know. You were talking about the ability for the consumer to get inside its device and use it in ways that were not appropriate or not expected for the device, creating potential interference and that sort of thing. This is a big deal. I mean, people, we've had this mentality, the Carter phone mentality, that I ought to be able to bring whatever I want to and use it. Are we actually moving? Rich made the point that the capacity of the network is not the network only. The device is part of the network, and if you don't have a 4G phone, we're using spectrum inefficiently. Do we see a tighter integration of devices with networks going forward? Does equipment become rentable, or?
Well, first, let me just correct that the issue in the Wi-Fi case was routers. It was the actual routers, the master devices that control the client devices that we all carry around. Those were the ones that were being interfered with. And what we're seeing out of the FCC are policies to enforce more security into those devices, things that the manufacturers would have to do to ensure they cannot be tampered with. My sense, and I'm not an expert on this, but my sense is that in the carrier space, the carriers enforce that as part of the development and certification of devices that go on their network. They want to make sure those devices are secure. So I don't think we have to worry about people tampering with their cell phones and using devices in a way that's contrary to FCC rules. I think on the client side, I think we're in good shape.
Yeah, we're in a very different world than we were, 5 years ago, 6 years ago. But we still have, we still want to make sure that our customers are well served. And as you point out, devices on the network are part of the network, and they can actually affect a consumer's experience. So yes, we still, look very carefully at devices that are on the network, but you just don't have the same ability that you used to. And you referred sort of obliquely to the C block rules. I think those rules were made at a time when we were in a different world, and now we're in a world where in order for us to operate for consumers to buy our product, we have to be much more open. But we do still have processes to make sure that certainly the devices when they come on the network are consistent with how we want to manage it. But they're much easier to go through. They're just not the way they used to be. We recognize that we had to change. And we had to change not because of FCC rules, we had to change because of changes in the marketplace.
Yeah, so, historically what you saw was, back in the day, the carriers had pretty tight control over consumer electronics and who gets through the door to be a device on my network. Apple kind of upended that. Now we've got Google, Android. I mean, the balance of power has shifted probably forever, and it was definitely a market development. Yeah.
Well, I know it was my telecom days, and the tight control over the devices made a lot of sense, because when something breaks, when your device stops working, you don't call Samsung, you call the telephone company. And if you don't, I'm sorry, I don't know what that is, that device that you brought onto my network is. And so it just makes sense. You're trying to train people, some of them not all that smart, to offer, fixes for things. And you kind of had to limit what you did. But I think the Apple model changed that significantly, because if my iPhone breaks, I don't go to the AT&T store. I go to the Apple store. And that's the change that had to happen. I think what the impact of that is a more concentrated handset market, because now you're having to build a network of stores, which makes the cost of being in that business is pretty darn high if you're going to have localized support for the devices. So you probably can see that industry, which is already somewhat concentrated. Say that way. Guys, I appreciate it. We're going to take a short coffee break before our next panel. How about a round of applause for our